business. So the objective was to increase the competitiveness of the product line of the semiconductor business unit, and also increase the design capability of the group. The problem they were facing at the time was it was really difficult to hire design engineers in Ireland because they were attracted by different industries. And so it was difficult to grow the company by hiring people in Ireland. And then the urgency, they felt that it was really important to get the product competitiveness as soon as they could. So that's the reason why they faced the need for an acquisition. So then Oak Semiconductor. In Portugal, so the same, the market is global, structure, flat, completely flat hierarchy. It's a 15-employee company, startup, and a spin-off from a university. So it wasn't a real company yet. Okay, so things were just starting, no structure, no procedures, so you can imagine the differences between the two companies. Yeah, so we'll move for the cultural comparison.
So unlike the other groups, we chose the pest analysis to basically to look at the macro environment of both countries. And in terms of, this is obviously our recommendations are focused on the cultural aspect of the due diligence. We also believe it's important to just quickly have a look at the other aspects of the pest analysis because they're invariably interlinked. And in this case of the political setup, what we see in Ireland on one side is a relatively stable, somewhat stable government. Ireland have had coalition governments for the last 30-odd years. People are quite used to that. They're in and out every other 5 to 10 years. And that's pretty much a stable setup. In contrast, you have in Portugal a very, very intricate and complicated legal and parliamentary system. And this plays into also a high level of uncertainty on avoidance. And we'll see that later when we look at the Hofstede model. So it's something worth bearing in mind because we see that that also impacts the cultural aspects. In terms of the economic aspects, I think we believe certainly the important things to look at here are, both companies are pretty similar. They're both euro, both small economies, quite high dependencies on larger economies. But what we see here as well is, especially for the Portuguese company being acquired, they need to bear in mind that the Irish company is in a very unstable economic environment. We've seen now since the acquisition that both countries have euro packages. Also we see that there's extreme exposure from the Irish side to a whole banking crisis. So if the Portuguese company which are being acquired, they should really look in detail into their acquiring company and ensure that they have stable financing. Who knows what they're being financed by in the current environment and if that's a stable backing. So that's on the economic side. Obviously the economic side is very, very detailed. We assume that that's going to be taken in more detail in a financial analysis as part of the due diligence. But just to hone in then on the technology factors, we didn't focus on too much. Both have pretty significant infrastructure, both are pretty advanced in terms of technology infrastructure. But 3 points to make on the social factors, and these are the main areas that we believe should be focused on to ensure that there's a smooth transition once the two companies merge and once they go into post-merger integration. One area for the Portuguese company is Portugal has an aging population, and that's coupled with a decreasing birth rate. So we see this as a threat to the company who's acquiring them. They're acquiring this Portuguese company because they want skilled employees and they want a workforce, and we see this as a threat. And maybe to mitigate the risk, they should possibly look at already having alliances with universities in Portugal to ensure that they have a constant flow of high-end PhD students, for this as an example. The other point in terms of the social factors is Portugal has a low entrepreneurial spirit, said, and and the regular attitude to education is quite low. And when we look at this situation here, you see the Irish company is acquiring them for actually to be entrepreneurial and to have the high-end skills. So that's something that they would need to go in more detail on and look at that in detail. And we see that that's also reflected in the Hofstede model. The Portuguese are very risk averse, and actually the Irish company are the exact opposite. So that's the biggest gap we see in the cultures. We don't see it as a showstopper, but we do believe that that's something they should look at in more detail. And the final social aspect that they should look at in more detail is the Portuguese culture is more of a work-to-live culture, and the Irish culture is more of a live-to-work culture. So this is at opposite ends of the same spectrum. This is because the Irish culture is a very masculine culture. It's very much an individual culture, and also very much about I. It's very much about achievement and getting ahead. In contrast, we see the Portuguese culture is much more collective. They would prioritise family over work, family over achievements, for example. And this might end up in a situation where you have people prioritising family situations over their work, where you have the Irish guys being exactly acting in the opposite way. So, and also we see things like Irish people will talk about work socially, and the Portuguese might be quite uncomfortable with that kind of situation. So what we've done for all of these social aspects, we have made recommendations in terms of checklists, in terms of surveys, and we've added those to the handout. And we've also looked outside the industry to the likes of Daimler Chrysler and other cultural mergers, let's say, and acquisitions, which might not necessarily have been successful, but certainly they're cases we should learn from. So we've added those also as checklists to our handout.
Yeah, so we just we had different models we were using to analyze the social aspect Helena was already mentioning. And when we looked at the Hofstede analysis, we actually really saw in numbers what we had as an impression before. So power distance, individualism, masculinity, there is a difference, but we said it's not that much. What is really very obvious is this uncertainty avoidance. So this was our major focus, actually, what we worked out here from the Hofstede analysis. And the long-term relationship seems to be pretty the same, so both countries are more short-term oriented, so there shouldn't be at all any issues. So, but what we saw, since this is really a merger which happened, and we had the luck to have some insights into the culture of the companies, what we saw, this Hofstede has really some limitations, because what we worked out here actually was very well solved. So I think it is very important if you make your cultural analysis and need this more, it's really just to zoom in on the next level and on company level and check if this is really true for the smaller system, or does the individuals have a larger impact. Otherwise, you would just impose something on the company, which might not be actually the case. So when we were looking at the Trump-Mass dimensions, for me it was pretty interesting, because from the information I found on the internet and what on web it was publicly available, I would have assumed that the small research-oriented Portuguese company is an incubator, but we had this insight into the company, and we were told, no, it's a small guided missile, so it is very task-oriented, despite that there are a lot of PhD students and professors who are actually leading this company. So at the end, we ended up that we had to integrate a guided missile as a small Portuguese company in an Eiffel Tower, which was the Irish. So actually the task emphasis was pretty much the same, so more role or project orientation, but the hierarchy was very obvious because the Eiffel Tower was a large company, already established, about 200 employees, really proper management system, and we had this research-based small startup where obviously the hierarchy was very flat.
So from all these analyses, our cultural due diligence, we identified 3 areas or focus which we had to take into consideration to reform: the economic and social factors, uncertainty and avoidance, flat versus hierarchical structure, HR factors. In this case, we will take the recommendation Gamina was giving about the social factors, so the avoidance, the uncertainty avoidance, which actually would be important to recognize inside the company through a survey, because probably the nature of the company allows to a different inside company culture compared to the country culture. The flat versus hierarchical structure is something that, of course, can give difficulty into the interrogation. And I would say our impression was being a startup and an SPU was a kind of an informal environment. So probably being the Portuguese country also adaptable to an hierarchical structure, we could eventually have a different restructure strategy during our due diligence analysis. And the HR factors, in this area, we think that we should take into consideration the collectivistic Portuguese culture compared to the individualistic Irish culture. So to mitigate certain factors, especially on the hiring and on the compensation strategy for the future development of the acquisition. So we recommend this acquisition, but there are a few factors where the due diligence has to focus on, and we are sure that this is going to work. Thank you.